So here's the deal. You just picked up that brand new camera and you're looking to start shooting video. Problem is, you get the camera home and open it up and charge it, and you get into the medium system and you figure out there are so many different settings that you can get into and adjust. In this video, we're going to talk about settings and some tips to get you started shooting great videos. My first tip is never go full auto. The problem with full auto is, depending on what you're shooting, it's going to be changing all your exposure settings and all your white balance settings. So you're never going to get a consistent image. You'll notice that your exposure is constantly changing based on maybe just a bright area or a dark area. It could be all over the place. So you're better off just doing this manually. That way you have complete control of what you want the image to look like. So now that we've talked about taking it off of auto mode, let's take it to manual mode. And we're going to look at exposure first. In a nutshell, exposure is how dark or light your image is. When it comes to exposure, there are three settings that we want to look at, and that is ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. These three settings make up the exposure triangle. The first setting is ISO. ISO is a measurement of how sensitive your sensor is to light. So a lower ISO, you're going to have a darker image. The higher the ISO, you're going to have a brighter image. The issue though is if you go too high in ISO, you can introduce grain that's unwanted into your image and making it look very muddy and grainy. Don't want that. You typically want to keep the ISO as low as possible. As I said before, you're going to introduce grain if you go too high, so keep the ISO at a minimum value. The second setting is shutter speed, and that is the amount of time that the shutter opens to allow light into your sensor. Shutter speed is going to depend really on what frame rate you decide to shoot. So I myself shoot 24 frames for talking head stuff, for stuff I want to shoot in real time. If I want to shoot slower motion stuff, I'm usually shooting 30 or more up to 60, 120 frames a second. Once you figure out what frame rate you're going to shoot in, then we can figure out what shutter speed we should be at. And this is determined by the 180-degree rule. This term comes from cinema cameras where they use a 180-degree shutter angle for natural looking motion blur. So in order to get that natural motion blur, you want to double your frame rate. If you're using 24 frames to shoot, shutter speed will be 1/48 or 1/50th. You get it close as you can in camera. If you're shooting 30 frames a second, it'll be 1/60. If your shutter speed is too slow, you'll notice a lot of blur in the image, especially when you have lots of motion. If the shutter speed is way too high, you'll notice that the image looks very choppy looking. So the 180-degree rule is in place to help you nail that natural looking motion blur. The last one is aperture, which is the opening of the lens that allows light in. A smaller aperture, usually represented by a higher f-stop number, is less light in. A lower number is more wide open of an aperture, allowing more light in. Aperture is really going to depend on how much you want it focused. If you have a higher f-stop number, you're going to have more in focus at one time. Your focal plane is going to be much deeper, the depth of field. If your f-stop number is lower, you're going to have a more wide open aperture. That's going to yield a tighter focal plane. The thing about these three settings is they all three work together to help properly expose your image. And this is where being in manual really is going to come into play, because it's going to help you creatively expose your image like you want and control your final image. The most important thing is to learn these rules, because there are many times when you want to break these rules. There's times where I do exceed the 180-degree shutter rule. It depends on the look you want. If you want something that looks more stuttery or more realistic or more action-packed, you may want to go for a higher shutter speed. So for aperture, you may want a higher f-stop and have everything in frame to be in focus. Or you may be shooting a small detail, and you want to isolate it from the background. That's where that more wide open aperture is going to come into play. All right, so something very important that we need to talk about as well, since we're talking about exposure. Once you get these settings dialed in and you go outside, or you find yourself shooting in a very bright condition, you're going to notice that the standard settings that we talked about are going to be too bright. You're going to be way overexposed. Let's talk about some ways that we can get around that, and also I'm going to give you a quick tip / a tool that you can use to help control your exposure using these settings. All right, as you can see here, we're pretty much set up with the settings we talked about earlier for just getting good old cinematic looking footage. I'm at 1/50th of a second, f-stop's at 2.8, and ISO is at minimum value, which is 200 for this camera. And as you can see, we have zebras. The zebras are just showing overexposed areas, and you can see, of course, the sky's overexposed, and there's that rail in front of us that's also overexposed. So let's look at some settings we can change to kind of demonstrate the exposure triangle. So as far as ISO, it's minimum, so there's no way we can get lower exposure with the ISO. So that's going to leave us to playing with our shutter speed and our aperture. So let's start here and let's start increasing our aperture. And you'll slowly realize that it is bringing down our exposure. Alright, see how the rail in the front is now free of the zebras. So, and we can continue on. There's not much you can do for the sky because the sky is so bright. But yeah, we'll bring it back down. And there's our zebras again. And our overall exposure, 2.0 plus, so it's overexposed there. Alright, next is our shutter speed. Same thing, so with the exposure triangle, we know by increasing shutter speed, we can bring our exposure down as well. And yeah, somewhere in there, it's looking pretty solid. One thousandth of a second shutter speed gives us pretty decent exposure there on the banister, the rail in front of us. Alright, so let's bring that back down. So these are things you can do if you don't have this next piece of equipment that I'm about to talk about. Alright, so let's go back to our normal settings here. We are at 1/50th of a second because we're shooting at 24 frames a second, 2.8 on our f-stop, and ISO 200. Alright, the piece of equipment I was mentioning earlier, slash the tip, is one of these bad boys, variable ND filter. So yeah, as you can see, we're able to control the amount of light coming in just by rotating this. We're able to control all the light, and we're going to put it on and see what we get. Okay, last. As you can see, we can rotate that filter, and there's the max. Let's go on down with it. Okay, it's starting to come on down, and there we go. Same settings, and we're able to expose properly to maintain our good motion blur and get the depth of field we want with our aperture and maintain ISO. You can even bring it on down and expose for the sky, which is awesome. Alright guys, that's all I have. If you have any questions at all, leave them down below. If you enjoyed this video, please like, please subscribe. You're going to be supporting me. I'm just starting this channel out, so I'm looking to help as many people as I can. And I'm in this journey to help and learn and help other people as well. So anything you can do to help me, I really appreciate it. Thanks.